today's a wonderful opportunity to actually hear from the guru in relation to employee ownership trusts, and I guess get some context as to where we are in Australia, and in a sense to hear and see what we're missing out on. We also have very helpfully two people who are embarking on the current journey of moving to or seeking to move into an employee ownership trust, to get their thoughts. But most importantly, I'd like to get Graeme's observations today, and perhaps work out how we can move forward and generate some enthusiasm and hopefully some government momentum. So, Graeme, I'll throw over to you.
Thank you. So thank you very much for this employee ownership roundtable. We have some guests here in Perth in person. Thank you very much for making the effort to come in. This is going to be an ambitious session. I'm going to outline what I believe Australia is missing out on in terms of employee ownership, and try to get us to agree what's actually holding back the growth of employee ownership in Australia, and what's needed to unlock its potential. Fundamentally, Australia is missing out on a success story. Australia has share plans, it has worker cooperatives, but it has almost no employee-owned private companies. And in particular, there is no established employee ownership business succession solution. And two slides will show what I mean in terms of numbers and impact. This graph shows the take-up of employee ownership in the UK over pretty much the last decade. In 2024, we achieved 560 businesses converting to employee ownership in a single year. That's 10 a week. The UK Employee Ownership Association has not finished collating numbers for last year, but it's going to be a similar number. And as you can see, employee ownership has gone mainstream in the last decade in the UK. And I believe any country starting out now can grow its employee ownership much quicker than that because of lessons we've learned. It's not just the UK. The success the UK has had in growing employee ownership is attracting the attention of other countries. And Canada, Denmark, and Slovenia have legislated in the last couple of years for new employee ownership models inspired by what's happening in the UK. And America has revitalized what it's doing to promote employee ownership. And I should say, I should make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what I mean by employee ownership. I mean all employees, directly or indirectly, having a significant and meaningful stake in the business for which they work. I'm not just talking about executive share plans. I'm not talking about financial participation. It's everything. It's having a shareholding stake that is sufficiently large enough to underpin genuine employee engagement in the business. And from a UK company law point of view, that usually kicks in at the 25% mark. Above 25%, I would say, is a significant sized stake. And again, as I'll explain later on, actually in the UK, it's over 50%, if not 100% ownership. That's the predominant model in the UK in that growth chart that I showed you. Now, something being popular doesn't necessarily mean it's good. Seem to be a lot of electric scooters around. I've been run over by a couple of them, and I've only been in Perth a couple of days. It doesn't necessarily mean that something's popular, it's good. With employee ownership, it is good. The incredible growth in UK employee-owned companies means we have a data set to examine, and research in the UK is showing significant differences comparing employee-owned businesses with non-employee-owned businesses. And these are across the board. Businesses see better financial performance, improved performance, in particular, an 8 to 12% greater productivity than non-employee-owned businesses. Employees benefit from an employee ownership ethos as I've said, that gives them individual and collective voice. And obviously in a 100% employee-owned business, there are no external shareholders. Surplus profits are available to pay to employees as bonuses or to improve training and development. And boards of directors are still chosen, I should say, because of their expertise and experience, but management finds it's easier to implement new ideas because of the support they get from the workforce. And employee-owned companies are exemplars for wider corporate purpose. Typically, they're really good at supporting their local communities, whether through volunteering or charitable activities. And they typically have environmental and energy policies. And all this means at scale, employee-owned businesses really can make a difference to an economy. And it's not just the UK Employee Ownership Association saying this. Numerous independent studies have come to a similar conclusion. I've got one here from the Northern Ireland government, where they found that employee ownership fitted in really well with a range of policy objectives that the Northern Ireland government had. So Australia is missing out on the benefits that employee ownership can bring. And in particular, Australia is missing out on employee ownership as a business succession solution. There's data here on the situation in the UK, how businesses may close if they don't have an exit solution that appeals to an owner of a business. And perhaps try to personalise this. Some of you in the room know a lot of business owners. Imagine the owners you know, perhaps 4 university friends who each want to step back from the business they founded at a different time, or perhaps there's a charismatic founder of a business that's already got a management team in place, but those managers can't afford to buy the business. And in any event, they want their charismatic founder to stay around because he's good for the brand. But the family has no able or willing member of the family to take over the business. These are all scenarios where employee ownership has helped provide a succession solution. And this is where we get to the core of the matter. Australia is missing out on a simple, easy to use employee ownership succession solution. The model that has worked in the UK is called the Employee Ownership Trust model. This is a model that has been adopted in the other countries I've mentioned, either where they have trust law by replicating an employee ownership trust, or if they don't, by creating a corporate equivalent. What distinguishes the employee ownership trust from other models is that once the shares are acquired by the employee trust, there are no individual allocations of shares to employees. There are no awards of shares to employees. And so you avoid all the complications of deciding on market value, buying and selling shares, finding the money to create an internal share market, all the tax and administrative complications that come from this, buying high, selling low, buying high. Instead, once shares are bought into the employee trust, that's it. They are held collectively on behalf of the employees, current and future. And the purpose of the trust is to provide long-term employee ownership of that company. And once the shares are acquired, there's no need for ongoing finance for the trust. It's bought the shares, it owns them. And so the key to a business succession solution we found is a vehicle, creating a vehicle, in this case a trustee company, that can acquire all the shares in an existing company. So there's no need to restructure the existing company. There's no need to ask employees to invest. There's no need to ask employees to change their roles and become owners. Instead, the trust steps in as the owner that takes over from the founder. And why is this so popular? Well, surveys of owners in the UK have consistently found that this really meets the needs of those owners. So 10 years ago, if you went to see your advisor and said, I'm looking for a business succession solution, the answer would probably have been sell to your lifelong competitor. Now there's an alternative, and that alternative is sell to employees using an employee ownership trust. And the reasons why it's so attractive are that it preserves the ethos of the business. It preserves the independence of that business, rewards the employees. And there's an element of legacy. What that owner has built up, they can see it carrying on in the safe custody of the employees and the employee trust. And there are other advantages. It also means sellers don't have to worry about sharing trade secrets as part of a tender process, and sellers can have control over timing. And if they want to, they can remain involved in the business afterwards. There's no reason for them to drop out completely. And what's happened in the UK, as I've said, vast number of companies have adopted this. We're fortunate in the UK that we have legacy businesses that have been employee owned, in the case of the John Lewis partnership, for 100 years. So this is a tried and tested method in the UK. But since then, high street names and predominantly small to medium-sized enterprises, but also some larger companies, have adopted this model, whether services based or manufacturing. And what is so, I think, frustrating with Australia failing to get momentum around the EOT model is that it's so easy to set up in a country that has trust law. This is what's happened in America. There is no special legislation in America, but the employee ownership trust is up and running. It's popular. And unlike, for example, the American employee stock ownership plan model, you don't need specialist advisors to advise on this. Once the model is understood, we have found in the UK that existing law firms, accountancy firms, will develop a skill set to advise on the model. And it's largely self-sustaining. Every transaction educates a new group of advisors as to the merits of the model, and it inspires the owners to tell their friends about it. We found largely that word of mouth promotes this model. You don't need, except perhaps in rural areas where there isn't the professional infrastructure or there are cultural differences. Generally speaking, this model grows by word of mouth, which is all bringing us to this question of, why is Australia missing out? Well, we do have to get into the financing. I haven't mentioned this. All employee buyouts essentially involve company money, using company profits over a number of years to pay a full purchase price. And this is where you get into tax complications. In America, there are workarounds. In Ireland, we have hit the wall again with tax problems, just getting in the way. But in America, there are no tax issues, so they've been able to get employee trusts up and running without government support. But here in Australia, and your host Andrew Clements can explain the technical details if anyone wants to get into this. But essentially, once you're using company money, especially when the trustee has become a shareholder, to make payments to selling shareholders, you come up against tax anti-avoidance provisions and questions over what the correct tax treatment is of those payments to the trustee company and onwards to the sellers. And so what's needed is official guidance. Not everyone can have an Andrew Clements sitting on their side, working the way through the tax details. This needs to be readily available across Australia. Employee Ownership Australia has asked the ATO for guidance. The response was, there aren't many EOTs, it's not worth us writing the guidance. And of course, there are never going to be many EOTs until the guidance is written. I have some sympathy for busy civil servants with this response. It's not their job to make new policy. It's there to implement existing policies. So I have sympathy, but it is an unusual argument. However, on the positive side, there are some things that don't need to be done. I would say there is no need for more research to prove the benefits of the EOT model and of employee ownership generally. Your experience with the ownership of small to medium-sized enterprises here in Australia will be very similar to that in the UK. I'm confident of that. And you don't need to produce standard documents. Employee Ownership Australia has already done that. Any guidance given can be based on these standard documents. So we're getting to the point, we're getting to the nub of it. Seems to me what is needed is political impetus. You need a government minister to look at this issue and say, I'm going to do something about it. Tell me what the problems are. We are going to sort them out. And it's for that minister to set the level of ambition. It may just be a tidying up exercise. Let's publish some guidance. And we'll see what happens. But it ought to be more than that. In Canada, Denmark, Slovenia, what the politicians there have said is actually this is such a stunningly good business model. And none of this is party political. Politicians of all types say, we recognise the benefits of this model, we need it, and actually let's think about a bit of tax law changes to get this up and running. The UK has a capital gains tax exemption, or rather a relief, which helps address the credit risk that sellers otherwise face. The typical payback period in the UK is 7 years. That's a long time to wait for your money. But if there's a bit of tax relief, you think, well, yes, I'm happy. I want to do this. I will go ahead with it. And actually, tax changes are more subtle. It's not just a win for the selling shareholder. Tax changes educate professionals. In the UK, we have a statutory definition of an employee ownership trust. So every advisor knows what an employee ownership trust should look like. And also, going back to that advisor, I mentioned who failed to talk about employee ownership as a business succession solution. Well, if there's a tax relief there, they've got to mention employee ownership as a succession solution. So there are some subtleties to changing tax law beyond just giving a tax break to a seller. Have to say in the UK, we've also got a benefit for employees. Instead of going through the complexity of setting up a share plan to make tax efficient awards to employees, we can pay up to £3,600 income tax free each tax year to an employee by way of bonuses. All employees have got to participate on a same terms basis, but that's really quite an incentive for employees to make the most of employee ownership. Now, where are we on this journey to get political support? Well, a charming lady I met, a businesswoman called Honor Northam, submitted a petition to the House of Representatives following my last visit to Australia. And we're waiting for a reply, unless something has come in the last couple of days, asking the ATO to provide tax guidelines for employee ownership trusts. And Employee Ownership Australia has sent in a detailed submission to the Treasury in support of this, explaining exactly what's needed. And fundamentally, the submission explains that under current law, establishing an EOT in Australia requires navigating a complex web of trust law, corporate regulation, and especially tax provisions. And this creates uncertainty and deters business owners and advisors from pursuing this model. A clearer legislative framework would provide certainty around the structure and operation of EOTs, clarify tax treatment for all those involved, educate the business community and make best practice clear, and encourage take-up by reducing compliance costs and perceived risks. And fundamentally, it would signal government support for this employee ownership model, this model of better business. And the UK government, some of you may have noticed, is very keen on raising taxes at the moment. Nevertheless, the EOT capital gains tax relief I mentioned has survived. In a budget that was otherwise heavy on tax raising, that tax relief still exists, and the current government believes in supporting moves to employee ownership, just as the coalition government that I advised agreed to introduce the measure over a decade ago. Australia is missing out. As I've said, it's missing out on this number of employee-owned companies. It's missing out on the potential for those businesses to contribute extra productivity, the well-being of employees and to communities and to economy of states and Australia as a whole. And it means business owners don't have the necessary choice they want to find a new owner of their business. So what's the elevator pitch? Well, actually, I was thinking about this. You bump into a politician in an air-conditioned lift, got a few moments with them, almost just say, what's your number one policy ask? And if you've got this in your back pocket, whatever they come up with, oh, I'd like to reduce inequality, tick the box. Employee ownership with its all employee bonuses will reduce income inequality. Pick it, saving the environment. Employee-owned businesses are exemplars for wider corporate purpose. So with that, I've given you my thoughts on what Australia is missing out on and what's needed to move the dial. I'm happy to take questions and also happy to get the views of everyone in on this call. So over to you, Andrew, as to how we manage that technically.
We had the I don't know whether you've got perhaps we could do it in two parts, whether there are any particular questions from the room that you had there, Graeme?
Yes, if somebody at the far end of the room could just say something, we can check, we can hear you saying that.
Good sound check.
Did you hear that, Andrew? It's a very quiet voice.
It might be best to repeat the questions.
Okay, I'll do that. So, does anyone have any comments or questions in response to?
My question is just very simply, how does it actually work? I'm not, as an example of a business, how does that trustee company work?
The question is, how does a trustee company work? What are the governance mechanics of that? Fundamentally, in an employee-owned business, as I've said, employees should have collective and individual voice. So as well as a participative management style, where managers are listening, responding to employees, and as well, typically, I would say, an employee council that works with a trading company board to deal with sort of week-to-week issues and develop bigger strategy. The employee ownership trust model brings another level of governance. In the UK, we establish bespoke trustee companies. Essentially, they're dormant companies, one per business. And the standard model of trustee board is a model that achieves parity between senior managers and employees as a whole. So you may have two trading company board, elected or selected directors, two employees on the trustee board from the workforce as a whole, and then somebody independent acting as a chair. And that body meets, it could only be a couple of times a year if the business is running well, and essentially acts as a custodian. It checks how the business is running. It checks it's a professional, successfully managed, independent business with an employee ownership ethos, and discusses anything that has come up that perhaps needs the involvement of the custodian at a higher level of governance. That's it in a nutshell. Any other questions, clarity from those in the room here?
Just clearly there's a lobbying issue here, and lobbying directly with politicians of all persuasions, and predominantly at the federal level, of course, although I guess you can get influence through the state. To what degree bodies like the different chambers of commerce and things like that, are they receptive to being part of that conversation? Because I don't, you know, in terms of the lobbying impact, the more influential business voices that are there, the greater the likelihood that there'll be a receptive ear by.
Yes, I have to say, in the UK, we went to the wider bodies afterwards. A couple of years after the legislation was introduced, there was an initiative to explain employee ownership to Federation of Small Businesses, to the Family Businesses Association. About 30 different organisations were brought together, and they all heard evidence about the benefits of employee ownership. And as a result of that, we broadened the support for employee ownership. But prior to that, it was essentially selective lobbying of key individuals who are supportive. And picking up on the state, that has been very important in the UK. Although the legislation was originally introduced following recommendations I made to the UK government, almost immediately the separate governments of Scotland and Wales started to take an interest. And because of regional cultural differences, it has been very important for the Scottish government, the Welsh government, and now the Northern Ireland government to come out and say they support employee ownership and promote regional initiatives to make sure that the same growth of employee ownership we've seen across England without too much sort of government-based initiative achieved in those regions. But again, that's largely out after the event. I think this comes down to getting the ear of a couple of key individuals responsible for the ATO and saying, why aren't you issuing guidance? Why aren't you looking at this? I'm involved in promoting employee ownership in Ireland, and what we've done there is get support from all the opposition parties. And one of those opposition parties essentially said, I'm going to get you in front of the business minister. This is such a good idea.
I don't think our opposition parties are in much of a state to be using at the moment. You're not talking to each other, I think.
Well, they may not be talking to one another in Ireland, but they talk to the Irish Pro-Show Association to say, yes, they had time to support employee ownership. And certainly all party support has been a key ingredient in the UK. This has never been, I mean, we've had political parties grandstanding from time to time, but essentially every politician, it seems, finds this a good idea.
That was certainly the message I received in the US too, that it was one of the few things that there was sort of bipartisan support for.
Did you hear that comment, Andrew, about bipartisan support in the States?
Yes.
Good. Jessica,
I had a couple of questions that have come through, Graeme, online. But I wondered whether what might be useful. Michael Pilbara's with us this morning, and is someone who is working through the journey. And before we perhaps go to some of the other questions, it might be just helpful to get Michael's insight, in a sense, on his process of trying to introduce employee ownership, and more particularly an EOT structure into his business. Michael, are you with us?
I am here. Thanks, Andrew. Very happy to jump in now. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thanks, Graeme, for your presentation. So just a brief introduction. My name is Michael Pilbara, and I have a consulting firm called Strategic Development Group. We have a team of about 20 at the moment, and we're based mainly in regional places in Yass in New South Wales and the Illawarra, and then a presence in Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, Queensland, Tassie, but so a dispersed, largely regional company. Our ownership to date is two couples who have owned the company essentially since its founding. And we feel like we've been a very collegiate company, and that's certainly the culture we've worked to really engender across the business. But we wanted to entrench that and take that further. And we wanted to find a way in where the whole team could share in the company's success and the success that they help deliver in a more sort of entrenched and organised way. We want to build and grow the company, and we know we had the sense that some sort of employee ownership would be good, as Graeme has said, for growing the company. And this is only a very early sort of thought bubble in the far corners of our mind, but just to have an option for succession planning, or to do some early thinking about founder succession. So we very enthusiastically jumped into the conversation about the employee ownership trust because that sounded like the right model for our team. We'd heard about the individual share ownership plans, and that didn't sound like the kind of collegiate approach that would fit with our culture. So we kind of jumped on this EOT idea when we first heard about it, and to be honest, have been talking about it, we feel, too long, for a few years, talking amongst ourselves as a team and with our board and with all our team, with Andrew and Alan at Employee Ownership Australia, and also very helpfully engaging with others like Honor Northam that Graeme mentioned, and also Jana De Wilde who'd set up the EOT with her team at Meld. So all of that's been wonderful and lovely, and we've been learning a lot and sort of moving down this path. But we are probably a classic case of a company that's hit a major barrier. That is the reason why we need policy change, and that why Honor's petition that she drove is so important. So as we followed down the path, we did a very logical step that Andrew Clements advised us, which was get the company valued. And so we did that, and that was an interesting and positive experience. What that then meant is we suddenly had real numbers to work with, and this is where the sort of brutal situation in our tax law came into stark sort of laser focus in our minds. So once we had the valuation, we were able to work out, what dollars would be involved in something like an initial 20% EOT was our starting point. We naively thought, you could just gift 20% of the shares to the EOT and happily go along. What we discovered is that even if we gifted them, then we would still be, the founders or the current shareholders would be faced with an exorbitant capital gains tax bill. And that just became insurmountable. That we just couldn't make it work under the current laws. And so I do yearn for what I understand is the law in the UK around that capital gains tax, which I think in the UK is a very smart thing for them to do. It's a productivity measure. The more EOTs, that's going to be great for the UK economy. But we discovered here that there was this sort of brutal barrier for us, that we just couldn't make the numbers work to sort of pay a tax bill for when we haven't actually received anything. So, we're happy to be case study number one of why the current system is just not right. We're still determined to proceed with, what the reasons we want to do it is to sort of share the profits amongst the whole team, and to bring the team into more formally into the governance processes of the company. So we're determined to do that, and sort of put the question back to Andrew Clements, saying, you're the smart lawyer who knows about all this. Is there a way we can achieve what we want to achieve and somehow overcome this capital gains tax barrier. So I don't know if it's okay for me to mention, Andrew, but I will, that you coined a new term, the synthetic EOT, which I won't try and explain here, but I'm sure Andrew can much better than me. But essentially a way in which we, in a sense, by contract with the team, sort of entrench that 20% profit ownership idea through contract rather than through share transfer, at least until the tax law changes. So that's where we are right now. We are determined that in this current financial year, we will have that synthetic EOT up and running, and then we'll be happy to join any lobbying efforts to help the powers that be see the value in changing the law to make it actually much easier and more conducive in the future. So yeah, so we've spent a few years on this. Hopefully, with the lessons we have, others won't have to spend so many years on it, and we'll look back in a few years' time at this dark time that we're in now, and appreciate that a government with foresight in the future changes the law to bring more EOTs into our economy. So that's the Strategic Development Group story. A hard road, but we're positive about the future. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Andrew. I just want to say thank you, Andrew, for, walking with us on this journey and bringing your legal mind to try and, find a solution that can work as things currently stand while we try and improve the legislation for the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I think my one observation to the group should be that no one should ever have to talk to me in relation to commencing or creating an EOT. And I think Graeme has alluded to that success in relation to this structure is that it is so easily and readily understood and easily rolled out that it is a simple, cost-effective way of generating a business succession model. And regrettably, where we are at the moment, I think, is we can get there, and Monica's on the line at the moment, so it'd be great to get her observations. But the ways to solve and move towards employee ownership, and Mel did this, are complicated and more complicated than they need to be to from a simple A to B outcome. Graeme, I didn't know whether you wanted to add some observations before we threw to Monica.
No, I don't know whether you're still facing a blank screen at your end. I'm wary of touching anything at my end in case I lose the meeting completely. So apologies for that. But I know Monica's joined us, and probably we should turn to Monica next, if that's that's all right.
Sure. Good. So I should introduce Monica. It's been my great pleasure to work with Monica over a period of time. Monica is, and I have to say, and please accept this in the way it's intended, a true force of nature.
Oh, good, excellent. I enjoy that. Yes, thank you.
And has embarked on the employee ownership route with great vigour and a lot of admiration. So I'd love to. It sounds like a little bit of the introduction you get with The Voice. Can you explain your story? But if you could explain your story, that would be really cool.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to speak as well. Is my audio okay? Can you hear? Great. So look, I've been part of the dental industry for about 35 years now. There's not many, workplace environments I haven't worked in, from public health, community health, corporate, done all sorts of things in dentistry. And having the opportunity now to have my own business, which has been operational for the last 10 years, I've been on a really deep dive philosophically about what legacy, again, do I want to bring to the world. And it became very clear in my career that I'm vehemently anti-corporate. And the way healthcare is going, globally in Australia, vet services and so forth, the corporates really are quite predatory and savage, and it's making life very difficult for us that want to maintain a certain standard of care and ethics, particularly in healthcare. And I was determined that my business would not be swallowed up by a corporate. And so when I came across employee ownership a few years ago, it really spoke to me volumes around building resilience against the face of the corporate monsters that just want to gobble you up, and maintaining some independence. And really, if I can quote Yass the Block from Birthsorg, really making sure we're investing in humanity before bureaucracy. That's my kind of healthcare. And so I had the luxury, I'm not sure what the other panellists, sort of your trajectory's been, but I did have the luxury of actually being technically a solo operator at the moment. And it's a very small business at the moment. I do have intentions to let it grow. But I did have the ability, as Andrew commented, to kind of throw myself at this, even though there were many unknowns, I think. But I was happy to take that risk because for me, philosophically and intellectually, there's really no other way to run a business and keep your ethics intact. So I'm not into exploitation.
Thanks for that. I'd be really interested in your observations about how your workforce has reacted to a new ownership structure.
That's a really good question. So for me, the biggest learning and the biggest most of effort I've needed to spend is in building culture, particularly around the idea of having as level a playing field as we can. So in dentistry and in medicine, hierarchy is king. We have the people at the top of the heap and we have the people down the bottom of the heap, and never the twain shall meet, or you've got 10 layers of management structure in between. So I've had to work really hard and continue to work really hard at fostering the culture of as much, equality as possible. So changing the mindset of the people who aren't traditionally have been trained or to accept or understand that to have a business mindset, essentially. So for some people, they get it straight away. Other people, it's taken work. And other people say, actually, it's not for me, and they've left.
Thanks, Molly. I think that's I'd love to get Graeme's observations on that, but it's interesting that has been an observation that we have seen across a range of the pilots that we've been engaged in, and that as lawyers and financial people, we're very often more focused on the process and the structure. And certainly, if we had the people from Meld on the line today, one of the biggest, not challenges, but challenge is probably the right word, but Monica was to bring forward the model in a way that people could understand and didn't cause them anxiety because it is different. And it's so that it was understandable in a way that it didn't impose responsibility and or liability on people in a way that might be counterproductive.
Yeah, so I've spent a lot of work framing it from the personal autonomy piece. Again, particularly if I just look at the traditional hierarchical structure, the dental assistants, let's say, they're not normally afforded any decision-making capabilities. They're largely thought of in a sense of, you're just the girls down the bottom making the cups of tea and cleaning the floors. That is traditionally what people expect. And I'm enjoying the challenge of re-educating them and helping them understand that their role is so much more important than that.
That's fantastic.
So I've got a lot of culture building.
Graeme, I'd be interested in your thoughts or observations around that issue of the introduction of employee ownership through EOTs and the workplace acceptance and engagement in the structure? What your experience has been in the UK?
Yes, it varies it does vary from business to business. Again, the great thing about the EOT model is you don't actually need employees to fully understand it on day one. The ownership changes, and it's perfectly acceptable for there to be a while whilst you build up understanding of what an employee ownership ethos means. And in the UK, you speak to existing owners of businesses about it, and generally they will say, look, I think I've got enough of a feel for my workforce to work out how we explain this to them without raising expectations too much, but at the same time getting engagement. What we're also seeing in the UK is for those who want to accelerate the process, there are consultants, former John Lewis Partnership representatives who are now providing assistance to those who wish to build up their employee engagement culture quickly. And each company can take it at its own pace. And generally speaking, there are a few hiccups. There's initial enthusiasm, and then things may falter a bit, and you need to renew that interest. But generally speaking, businesses get the difference. Managers get the difference, and employees get the difference. And they realise it's not about insisting there are chocolate biscuits in a meeting or necessarily having the latest bit of kit, that it is about how to run a business profitably and successfully. Employees can't always get what they want, and nor do managers all the time. It is about achieving that right balance, what works in a particular business.
Thanks, Greg. There were a series of questions that came up. Jessica, do you want to take those, or be happy for me to?
Yeah, sure. No, I'm happy to. I'm happy for you too, Andrew. I was just going to jump in. I thought it might be helpful just to introduce myself as well. So my name is Yass Mitchell. I am co-chair of the EOA board along with Andrew, and I am a lawyer. I've spent my career in employee share plans, which, as Graeme rightly pointed out, is a form of ownership, but not meaningful for most employees. I work for a law firm that is based in the UK. The law firm specialises in share plans. We do not advise on EOTs, but the law firm is owned by an employee ownership trust, 100% owned. So I thought, and I have kind of watched that process for the last 5 years. The founders sold to the EOT in 2020, and I thought it might be useful to share a little bit of my experience of what I've seen happen there. Firstly, on the sort of softer benefits, I think, having worked in law firms for over 20 years and been involved with law firms, that the culture is extraordinary across the board, from the most senior people to the most junior people, and that's across legal staff and support staff. So I'm sure it's different in every business, but I will say that I think this law firm could be a poster child for being able to retain what the founders set out to do, and for having true ownership across all employees. In terms of employee engagement, there's a few ways that's done. The firm itself is run by senior lawyers. There is a trustee board, and on that board, any employee can nominate to be on the trustee board. And this, I mean, I know there's lots of different ways it can be done. This is the way it's done, the way it's done for this firm. So, for example, we can have a secretary on the board, we can have support staff, we can have an admin person or a finance person or a legal person, and all those people have nominated, and then there's an employee election. And then there's other sort of, not so much, there's not a formal council, but there are town hall meetings and various ways that employees can have their voice heard. With the reception that you mentioned too, I think that one key thing, and Graeme has also noted this, is that the level of engagement in actually running the business can be pretty much nothing. So you can have your voice heard and represented, but for the people who don't want to be engaged in the EOT, they don't have to be. They can do their job, they can be paid their normal salary, get their bonus, and that's it. People who want to be involved at any sort of level, like they want to nominate to be a trustee, then they can do that. And I think that really helps, because some people don't want to be engaged, and they don't have to be, but they can still be a beneficiary and effectively an owner. So I think that helps. And then picking up on one of the questions that's come through about, in Australia, we have a lot of small businesses under 25 employees, and there might be a big gap between people who manage and then everyone else, and then a gap in the managerial and leadership skills. I know for the firm that I work for, I think there was a pretty long transition period where people were stepping up into various roles to take over. So it wasn't a sort of cliff. It was, 1 to 2 years of placing people and readying them to take over those roles from the founders. Yeah, okay, so just looking at some of the other questions, and I think this is for probably mainly Graeme, maybe also Andrew. Oh, just on the financing as well, with this law firm, the founders were paid out over profits. And my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, Graeme, is that for most businesses in the UK, the founders have been paid from profits, and you said the average is over 7 years. So it's a long period of time, because one of the other concerns raised in the questions was there'll be a reluctance from external banks or financial institutions to provide finance up front, so that the founders get paid straight away. The trust is clear of debt effectively. My understanding is that in the UK, it usually happens that the founders are paid over a period of years. If the business goes under, then there is no liability on the employees, no debt to clear. But of course, that requires the founders to want to do this enough to take on the risk that they won't be fully paid out from profits in due course. And I think that's where the tax exemption is a huge help. And I know for Australia, I think the initial goal is just not to have actively adverse tax consequences or major tax risk, but eventually to get the kind of numbers that we've seen in the UK, then there would need to be probably some level of financial incentive as well for founders to take that risk. Can I pass that to you, Graeme?
Yes. I mean, it has been remarkable that sellers in the UK have been prepared to accept deferred consideration, as I say, with an average period of 7 years. I sat with one owner recently who said he'd actually been paid out in 3.5 years, because the employees had all delivered this increased productivity and profitability. And instead of being annoyed, he was actually quite pleased. He said, well, obviously this plan worked. I'm not upset. And the employees were saying, honestly, we weren't keeping things back from you. We weren't hiding contracts from you. It is a long period. I have had to advise very elderly people, you've left it too late. You're going to have to look at something else. If you do want to be paid more up front, then banks are prepared to lend some money to the trading company to accelerate those early payments. But generally speaking, this is all vendor finance that is driving this initiative in the UK. And as Jessica has said, the capital gains tax exemption up until autumn last year was a large part of getting sellers to accept. But we've seen transactions carrying on since then, when tax relief has been halved and is only marginally better now than selling to trade buyers. Just got a follow-up question here in the room, if you bear with me.
Yeah, on that deferred sellout, is there an annual revaluation of the company that just the company?
No, it's a good question. I mean, essentially, a price is fixed. The UK model is you fix the price, and then that is what is paid in instalments, probably with interest. So there's no continuing revaluation of the company. You set that price, and the message to the employees is, if you generate more profits quicker than expected, you pay the price off quicker, and you get to that day when, in effect, you are debt free, and there's more money available to be paid out as bonuses. Are there other questions that have come up in the chat, Jessica, that we should deal with?
Yes, thank you. A couple of questions have come through. This might be one for Andrew, is about your synthetic EOT. So how does that work, and does it deal with the current tax barriers?
So does it deal with
the tax barriers that are preventing these key businesses from becoming EOTs at this stage? Yeah,
I guess if you strip away what the current tax barriers are, in a sense, they reflect a conundrum in that for Australian tax purposes, there's a strong preference for a transfer or sale as a means of effecting the transaction in order to get the capital gains tax relief, firstly. Secondly, that the point where the liability arises is when you contract to sell. So that a conventional deferred consideration model is not all that effective because it produces a day one tax liability but deferred consideration. So the trigger then is to try and match the taxing points or the cash access points with the taxing points. And in a sense, that is probably the greatest conundrum for the legislative reform. But it's a small legislative reform. In the vernacular, it's being done under a local, not a general, in terms of the tax system.
Andrew, sorry, just to say, in the UK, separate from the EOT legislation, we have that. If consideration is paid in instalments over an 18-month period, you can ask the tax authority to pay your capital gains tax in instalments. And under that arrangement, 50% of whatever gets paid as an instalment is taken in tax until the full tax bill is paid. So you don't face dry tax charges. And clearly, that's an issue that needs to be addressed in jurisdictions that don't have that flexibility.
And it's a good example. It's a good example, in a sense, Graeme, of in terms of the reform process that we've worked to. Putting it very bluntly, we've tried to make it a simple, small target, because that conundrum of dry gains for deferred consideration is a more general problem and a general issue that needs to be worked through. To go to the synthetic model, in a sense, if you think about ostensibly what we've got in an EOT, there are really three elements to it. There's participation in reward, which is the ability of the employees to receive a percentage of the profits generated from the business, firstly. And secondly, to be engaged and involved in the management process and direction. It's the third element of the sell down in the equity which creates the tax conundrum. So in a sense, the synthetic model is very much focused on creating through contract, a basis upon which a particular level of reward is directed towards the employees, colloquially, as if they were owners. So a percentage of the profits as if they were owners, firstly. And secondly, to create through contract to the EOT rights of management and control, so that even though the business isn't owned by the EOT, it has rights in respect to the management of it, so it gives the employees the same control and conduct. What it does not do is it doesn't facilitate, a funding of the exit for the founders. So it is to that degree a partial solution to a problem, but it's a partial solution that works at least as a holding practice as a holding measure for people who want to better engage or engage their employees more in both reward and control.
Okay, well, that sounds really interesting. And I was just wondering if that could maybe be used almost as a practice model as well, before exit plans are in place. So to deal with those, how will it actually work in practice, and, I guess transitioning employees to take on a managerial and leadership role, or even just inputting in a significant way. It sounds like there wouldn't be any major downside to it. And effectively, it could prepare the company to transition to an EOT for an exit sale. I'm just going to pull a couple of other questions. One is, I think, Graeme, for you with the UK and elsewhere, and what would we see in Australia at the moment, is for the employees working within an employee ownership trust, any liability issues for them? and what are the tax advantages for them in having profits paid out through the trust?
So the tremendous thing about being beneficiary of a discretionary trust is that there's no tax liability associated with it, because you just have a mere expectation of benefiting. Sorry, excuse me. So you become a beneficiary of the trust automatically on becoming an employee of the trading company, and you probably cease to be a beneficiary and you cease to be an employee of the trading company, with no tax consequences to any of that. I think and there's no liability either for the debt. That's something the trustee owes the seller. It's not personal to employees. I think the only issue that does exist in Australia is the idea of employee representation on the board of a trading company. In the UK, in a good number of employee-owned companies, there are employee elected or selected directors on the trading company board. But in Australia, there's a the Fair Entitlement Guarantee regulations will kick in and stop any director, however they were put on the board, from benefiting in the event of the business going under. And again, it's something we have advocated for change on, but at the moment, I think when implementing this model in Australia, you would have to say to employees, don't become a representative on a trading company board, because there's a risk you might miss out on your redundancy entitlements if the business goes under. Stick with attending the meetings and saying something, but don't take on the responsibilities of being a director. And I think, Andrea, this is the only issue we've come across in terms of employee involvement in the EOT model, isn't it?
I think so. Certainly in terms of liability. And I guess the key with all of these things is it's only an issue if there's an insolvency event. I'd be interested to get your thoughts around the experience in the UK regarding EOTs and businesses operated through EOT structures and insolvency events, and how that's better or worse record, I guess, is the question.
Clearly, businesses are not EOT-owned businesses are not immune to business failure. But the ones I have seen, I would say, are down to typical externalities, things beyond the control of the business. Occasionally, historically, we've seen, I would say, hubris on the part of senior management, who are sort of ignoring employee views, have gone ahead with projects they shouldn't have done. But I think we've got a better handle on that now, and really understand what engagement means, and business decisions being taken prudently. Construction industry, we mentioned law firms. Jessica mentioned law firms becoming EOT owned. There's quite a number of them now in the UK. Construction industry firms are also a boom area for employee ownership, and they are notorious for going out of business. And I think all I can say is that EOT-owned construction companies have a better record of survival than other construction companies. Now, generally speaking, this is a viable, successful business model, and does not raise additional risks, I would say, from a business point of view. Sorry, excuse me. There's a question on tax. Again, fundamentally sharing profits with employees, if they are paid out by a trading company, they'll be taxed as if they are bonuses paid by any company, however they are employed. And I think we're not looking for necessarily a favourable treatment here in Australia. We just want to get to the situation where businesses can be owned by an EOT.
Thanks, Graeme. Going on on a different tack, there's a question around what do unions think of employee ownership and specifically the EOT model? So especially where unions are closely aligned with government enforced, has that had an impact? I suspect the answer for Australia is it's not enough on union or government's radar to have been tested, but I'd be interested to hear what your views are on that for the UK and maybe US or elsewhere.
Yes, again, the UK is not the best country in which to sort of talk about the attitude of unions to employee ownership, mainly because there's very little union involvement in small to medium-sized enterprise or even larger private companies. Our experience generally, when it does turn up, is that local officials can be supportive, but at a national level, there's perhaps little engagement. Although during the Nuttall review period, I did get the UK Trades Union Congress to essentially agree a manifesto on employee ownership that largely aligned with my views. They wanted to see a little more perhaps mandated participation. I think the biggest example we've got of trade union support is in Denmark, where Denmark trade unions are very much a part of conducting business in Denmark. And I attended a meeting of all the major trade unions in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and they were all extremely supportive of employee ownership and are looking forward to a leading role in promoting the Danish equivalent of employee ownership trusts.
Oh, that's a little bit surprising, I think, but that's fantastic. As in, I don't know that. I think historically, in maybe other forms of employee ownership, and rightly or wrongly, there has been more resistance from unions. Semi-related, there's a question around what responses, and this is maybe one for Andrew, what responses have been received so far from the ministers and government bodies that have been approached, like the Productivity Commission? You talked a little bit about the ATO, and I know that, Graeme, you've met with various politicians or regulatory body representatives, and you know, my impression is that sort of, as you said, interest, general approval in principle, but it's still a sort of, it's more of an unknown. It hasn't reached a point where it's really on anyone's short-term radar. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
Can I split that into two parts? The first is in relation to our engagement with the ATO. So just to put that into context, we provided the ATO with a full set, a very full set, or a complete set of the documents to establish an EOT, with a series of questions that we believe are within the scope of what could be accommodated within the existing tax law. What we were looking to do in relation to that was to then get some public assurance, so that the ATO would provide general guidance so that people could then, without reference to people like me, take those documents and have an understanding of what the tax treatment is. Regrettably, there was a reluctance to provide that general guidance, and the response was that it would be because it's a little bit of a chicken egg. We can't see the need because we don't have the demand. You won't get the demand because people can't actually facilitate this because it's too complicated. As I said, no one should talk to me in relation to these sorts of questions. To get private rulings, there are about 4 or 5 private rulings. It's just too complicated. So that is the conundrum in relation to the ATO guidance, which was the genesis then of the petition. The response that we put to Treasury was, or the Treasurer, was more general, because the Petitions Committee referred it to the Treasurer for response within 90 days, which has then been referred to the Treasury. In relation to that, we provided, with Graeme, Graeme's help, a very detailed submission, and I'd encourage you, any of you, to, if you've got an interest, to have a look at it. Not only just for the technical aspect to it, but it actually talks about lots of the benefits. We've had tried to engage with the Treasurer's office in relation to that. neutrally expressed they've been non-committal, in that it's gone to Treasury and we haven't been able to engage with them. We will and are intending to go through for a submission to the Treasurer for the pre-budget submissions, with a view to try and engaging in it. But I guess to the question, not with any degree of vigour have we received a response to date, which is disappointing.
Graeme, do you have anything to add to that?
I think all I can say is that, to repeat, politicians, whatever their background, when I've engaged with them on employee ownership, have been supportive. They see it as a good thing. And I have to say, they are open to embarrassment. And I think probably the winning message is, and this is certainly the situation in Denmark. Shortly before they announced legislation in Denmark, it's probably a coincidence, but I had a meeting with an all-party group of Danish politicians, and effectively they said, look, the UK does not have a history of mutualism and cooperativism that we have in Denmark. How on earth have you managed to get this up and running in the UK? If it's up and running in the UK, we've got to have it here. It's embarrassing we don't have it. So I think shaming politicians, sorry to say it, but I think that's the strongest message. Just say, look, you are missing out. All this is happening, not just in the UK, but they're picking up on it in other countries. You're missing out on something. Please pay attention. So somebody here at this meeting, either online or in person, is going to bump into a politician on their way home. And it's your job to say to them, look, do something about this.
Okay, so that's a call to arms for all of us. I'd just like to share a message too from Monica, who's just spoken about her journey and has had to leave. But I thought this was well worth passing on. Anyone on the fence re EOT, I encourage to consider overcoming analysis paralysis. Could well open the door to a brilliant opportunity for your business legacy. Courage is calling. I think that's a wonderful message for all of us as well. Now, we only have a few minutes left, I think, and I think we've covered off all the questions. Jump on if there is anything that you have that hasn't been answered. There's a couple of sort of related ones, like sounds like a derivative, which I think is referring to the synthetic EOT structure, Andrew. So whether ASIC has a role in this, and whether that's something that is potentially a significant barrier or not. And then also around how the complexity is simplified and communicated to the beneficiaries, which I think we've touched on a bit too. Yeah, but I think other than that, we've wrapped up all the questions. If there's any final burning questions or comments from the audience or from the panelists.
I think if I could just emphasise how relatively straightforward the model is. Essentially, trustee company owning all the shares in the existing trading company, so there's no need to restructure the existing business it's taken over. Trustee company board, relatively flexible to ensure it's got the best possible board to manage the business and pay off the sellers. And we've taken this model in the UK into a whole range of business environments. Law firms, heavily regulated. We've managed to get the Solicitors Regulation Authority to accept EOT ownership. Similarly, with financial firms, Financial Conduct Authority. I've used an EOT as a way for a listed company to sell off a subsidiary it didn't want, to sell it to the employees. Really, it has proved its worth, not only in the variety of sellers I described to you, but also in the nature of the businesses, and predominantly SME. 25 people is fine for an EOT ownership. I'd start to worry when you get down to, say, 10 or so or less. That's when you really ought to be thinking of a worker cooperative, because everybody will be so closely involved in the employee ownership message. But larger companies convert as well. And of course, we have the John Lewis Partnership with tens of thousands of employees that has been employee owned for over 100 years. So Australia really is missing out. And perhaps a year from now, if I make a return visit, you're a big country, there are a few bits I haven't visited yet. Maybe there'll be some progress to report.
Graeme, if I could perhaps just close today by thanking you for your ongoing commitment to this issue. I don't think there are many people on this, either at the meeting or online, who actually really understand just the extent of Graeme's influence around this. So for that, we thank you. Graeme's a very active ambassador of EOA. So thank you for that. Also, Monica, who we've lost, and Michael, thank you for joining today. And I guess the one thing I would say to all, whether online or in person, is we'd love to hear more from you in relation to things that are important for you in terms of employee ownership. Because I guess at EOA, we can only be effective when we hear from you. So to use that wonderful millennial expression, please reach out to us. So thank you all for joining, and all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.